Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode in our Customer Confidence series, where we'll be exploring the fundamentals of earning and keeping customer trust through transparent, customized, and as we'll discuss today, accessible billing and payment experiences. So I'm Matt Radel. I am the VP of Design and UX for InvoiceCloud. I've been working in the digital payment software industry for about 20 years. And I've been focused more on building accessible experiences for the last 8 or so. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And if you don't know us, InvoiceCloud provides a fully cloud-based digital billing and payment platform. We primarily serve utilities, insurance, local government, and county tax companies. We were formed in 2009, so we've been around for about 16 years. When we look at our value proposition, we are built to drive digital adoption, elevate customer satisfaction, and simplify transactions. We use behavioral and operational insights to go beyond simply processing payments by intelligently engaging customers with personalized reminders and easy-to-use self-service options. Our North Star has been, and always will be, making our customers' lives easier, from reducing complexity to increasing on-time payments and lowering call volumes. And providing a trustworthy digital billing and payment experience is critical to making that happen. So in today's session, we're going to touch on a few different aspects of designing accessible payments. Specifically, why you should be considering accessibility beyond checking the box for compliance. Who suffers from inaccessible payment offerings? The operational benefits of accessible payment systems. We'll get you up to speed on the April 26 ADA Title II deadline. And finally, we'll overview what you should expect from a compliant payment vendor. Everyone who's registered for today's session will also receive those expectations in a checklist, so you can evaluate your own platform's accessibility and use it for conversations with prospective future vendors. As questions pop up along the way, throw them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them live, or we may ask you for your email address to get you a thoughtful answer later. So with that, let's dive in. So accessibility beyond compliance deadlines. So accessibility is a really big topic. And broadly, what it means is we're creating an experience that's open to everyone. So accessibility isn't just the right thing to do, but it's also, as we'll talk about later, an increasingly legal compliant. Payments are critical for Touchpoint for Tessa stop. Let's do from this top again. So let's talk about accessibility, and it's a really big topic, right? So accessibility is really about creating an experience that's open to everyone. And accessibility isn't just the right thing to do, it's increasingly a legal requirement. And payments are a critical touch point and trust signal. For many customers, paying a bill might be the only way that they interact with your organization. And if that experience isn't accessible, it risks eroding your trust and damaging your reputation. And beyond compliance, accessibility also drives efficiency for your organization. So who really suffers most from the accessibility gap? You know, accessibility is often a much broader term than many people will realize. And so we see in a couple of different segments here specifically that are heavily impacted.
Tessa, stop. Okay, sorry. Hold on. It clicked when I didn't mean to click. Do you mind starting from the top here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So who suffers most from this accessibility gap? So the definition of accessibility is broader than many people realize. And so this really impacts a few key segments really heavily. So the first of which is seniors that are struggling with complex interfaces. So those that are 55 and up, they didn't really grow up with the type of digital experiences we know today. So they will often struggle with interfaces that have, too much text, or they rely too heavily on acronyms, or they just have too many form controls. So seniors can be really heavily impacted by inaccessible experiences. Next, there are customers who need multilingual options. So in order to accept a payment digitally, you literally need to speak the customer's language, right? So it's really important that your platform is providing those options for different languages so that you can accept the payment in ways that your customers are going to understand. And lastly, there are communities that have limited access to technology and banking infrastructure. So lower income or rural areas that still have struggles with trying to connect to broadband level access, or there are many populations that are just completely unbanked. So we need to be thinking about all of these segments when we're thinking about building an inclusive and accessible experience. So thinking about the ripple effect of inclusive design. So this is, in my opinion, probably the best piece of design that Microsoft has ever done. This is depicting just how the best practices and the guidelines that we follow in building an accessible experience are really beneficial to everyone. So if you go look in the top left here, so if you have someone who has one arm, so maybe they were born with one arm, or maybe they lost it at some point in their life, but they have one arm. The best practices that we put in place, so larger buttons, making things easier to reach on a screen with one hand, those benefits can also benefit someone who is in a temporary situation. So for example, if you've broken your arm. So if your arm's been in a sling for a few weeks or longer, you can understand like how quickly you need to get good at doing something with one hand. And even further, getting into a situational aspect, right? So this isn't an ongoing thing, but it's something that can sort of pop up as you're experiencing life, right? So if you're a new parent, for example, I remember when my son was little, I was constantly picking him up. I had to learn how to do things with one hand. So all of these things that ultimately are driven by adhering to accessibility guidelines in terms of thinking about an inclusive design are not just beneficial for those with permanent disabilities, but they're beneficial to everyone who's using the product. And so what do we mean when we say digital payments for everyone? So this might be a term that you've heard us use as InvoiceCloud here for a bit. This is something that's really been our rallying cry for a while. And we've been on this accessibility journey for years. We've been educating our staff. We've been making changes to our platform. We've been talking to some of the segments that we just talked about, especially some of the older citizens that we can serve. We've been constantly trying to build a more accessible experience across our entire platform. So it is something that is fundamentally baked into what we do. It's not just a singular destination. It's not a bunch of boxes to check. This is something that is core to how we design and build a product across the board. So let's talk about what accessibility looks like for payments. So this is a really good example that you can start to look for when you're evaluating your own site or maybe vendors that you're working with. So this example is in regards to text contrast. So it's really important to have high contrast ratios so that you can understand as a low vision user, or maybe even somebody that's outside trying to look at their screen, in order to use the product more effectively. So on the left, we have an example of what is good high contrast, right? So you see the darker text is in the foreground and it's against a lighter background, right? And the text is really large, it's easy to see. This is something that would actually successfully pass the guidelines that we'll talk a little bit later in ensuring that it's an accessible experience. So if you compare that to the example on the right, this is an example of low contrast, right? So the text is small, it's against a lighter background, it's really hard to see. And again, for someone with a vision issue, especially one of the many forms of color blindness that affect many Americans, or someone who is outside or maybe further away from a screen, it can be really challenging to actually see and read this text and interact with it. So this is something you can keep in mind as you're evaluating your own experiences today. So this is an example of an update that we made in our product to adhere to contrast ratios last year. So as you can see on the left, previously our payment summary during our checkout flow previously had a gray background. It had smaller text. It was a little bit more challenging to see. And if you compare it to what we did on the right, so we followed the guidelines and we did research in terms of the best ways to present the information. And so you can see, even at this small size, it's a lot easier to understand the information that's in the payment summary, right? So it's got a lighter background, darker foreground text. The text is larger and easier to see. This leads to a better experience for everyone, not just low vision users, in understanding what they need to do or what's due with their bill. So applying these contrast ratio principles to our product currently has made for a better experience for everyone. So let's talk about, zooming out a little bit, and let's talk about the benefits of accessible design when it comes to your organization. So first, as I get into talking about accessibility, I think it's really good to have sort of a cautionary tale in mind, right? So if you don't really take accessibility seriously, if you don't really put it to the forefront of your thinking, what can really happen, right? And so there's actually a really good example that entered the mainstream back in about 2016 with Domino's Pizza. So there was a gentleman, a blind man, Gamero Robas, who was simply trying to order a pizza, right? And he was doing this with an assistive technology called a screen reader. So as he was going through Domino's site, the screen reader is reading the interface to him so he can understand what he's doing as he's trying to order his pizza. Because of the way that Domino's site was built, it was completely inaccessible. So he wasn't able to understand how to order his pizza, and he definitely wasn't even able to understand the pizza tracker, which we all know and love, in terms of, hey, is my pizza baking? Is it on the way? Is the delivery person going to be here, in a couple minutes, right? This was a very inaccessible experience to him. So they sought legal action. He sought legal action against Domino's, and Domino's unwisely fought it. They pushed back. They said that they didn't really need to adhere with this, things like that. Long and short, it went to court, and Domino's lost, right? So not only did they have to go back and make all of the changes that they needed to make in the first place in order to comply with the guidelines that they should have been thinking about, but more importantly, they suffered the brand damage and the reputation hit of going to court against this type of an issue. So it's just really good, I think, to have as a backdrop sometimes of thinking about like what's the worst can happen. And frankly, the worst can be kind of bad if you don't take accessibility seriously and think about it as it pertains to your payment experience. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the potential price of inaccessible payments when it comes to your customer experience. So I think a really key stat to call out is that 1 in 3 Americans have some sort of accessibility need that will make them abandon a payment flow if their needs aren't met. So that's a really high percentage of people that will simply walk away, right? Which makes complete sense. So what does this lead to? What are the main challenges that this presents, right? So fundamentally, as we just talked about, this erodes customer trust and satisfaction. It is your responsibility to offer an accessible experience to your customers. They will hold you responsible as someone who needs to make sure that they can achieve what they need to using your site, right? So this will fundamentally erode customer trust and satisfaction and make them sort of second guess you a little bit in terms of at least your online presence. Second, you see the 1 in 3 number. This will negatively impact your digital adoption. And so as we talk about digital adoption, we're meaning, the number of people that are paying their bills online. If you fundamentally have an experience that is inaccessible, you're literally putting roadblocks in the way of people paying online. So it can be really challenging, and it can push your adoption numbers down in terms of who can actually complete a payment online. And then finally, it's a time and resource drain, right? Like this is something that if you don't have folks that can pay online, it's going to cause more issues for you. Folks are going to have more issues with the payment experience on the site. Folks are going to say that they need to make payments on by the phone, or they need to walk into the office and talk to you, things like that. So it ultimately costs you more time and more resources in the long run by not having an accessible experience. But let's talk about the more fun, the key benefits, right, of having an accessible experience. The biggest thing that we see is accessibility can really accelerate adoption, right? So we were just talking about like getting more people to pay their bills online. So, if you think about it today, if you have folks that are not paying their bills online, they're really in a call first mentality, right? Like their first reflex is to pick up the phone and talk to one of your customer success reps in order to pay their bill, right? But that requires interaction for you. That requires your time, right? If you have a more accessible experience, if you have an easier experience to use, you're empowering your users. You're empowering your customers to pay their bills, and that creates repeat users. Folks are more likely to make those payments online. So if we look down the side on the key benefits here, so that leads to lower call volumes, right? So if there are fewer people that are calling in to make a transactional type conversation to pay their bill, that means you have fewer people to talk to, right? So it can drive down call volumes, fewer delinquencies. So if someone is paying online, they can enroll in AutoPay. They can have far more reminders in terms of saying, hey, your bill is due. By the way, your bill is due. By the way, your bill is due, right? So you can have fewer delinquencies in the case of someone who's paying digitally. And then in the inverse of what we just talked about, there's a cost and time savings. So if you are spending less time making some of those transactional conversations on the phone or in person, or less time processing checks, that is more time that you and your staff can focus on bigger issues, and you can save additional cost and time just in terms of impacting your staff and making them happier. And so further on that, so the way that a lot of organizations are measuring their reputation is via CSAT, right? It's a number that I think a lot of folks sort of fixate on correctly and use as a North Star for themselves to see how they're doing. And so there can be key benefits here. Again, an accessible experience, an experience that's inherently easier to use. There's a lot of key benefits in the sense that you'll have a very positive impact on your brand reputation. As people are making these payments online, they understand that they have these capabilities. They're going to view you more favorably. They're going to start to put you in a similar sense to a lot of the e-com type experiences that they have with particular retailers and things like that, right? So it'll be a positive impact on your brand reputation, which leads to more satisfied customers. So the less that someone has to worry about, interacting and being on hold, waiting for someone to take their call, things like that, they're going to be more satisfied. They're going to get their payment in and they're going to move along and they're going to be happier about it, which leads to higher digital adoption and a better staff experience. Like we just said, the less time that someone has to spend on the phone with more or higher volume of these transactional conversations with customers and things like that, they can offer better service to those that they still need to deal with other issues. So the ADA Title II deadline. So this is the new update that's coming out that we can talk about in more detail. And so just a quick background. So the American Disabilities Act was originally founded around 1969, I believe it was. And then it was updated in the 90s to include digital properties. And so now the Title II ruling is some even more stringent requirements that specifically target U.S. government organizations. So that includes city, county, and state governments, local departments such as police and fire, public K through 12 and higher ed, in addition to special districts like water, fire, and parks and rec, right? So pretty much anyone that is in, a government organization in the U.S., you need to comply with the ADA Title II guidelines. But what does that mean? So you understand that you have to comply, but what does compliance look like, right? So the rule requires that web content and mobile apps must conform with the WCAG 2.1 Level A and Level AA guidelines. So WCAG, or as some in the industry call WCAG, WCAG is a set of guidelines that are really intended for you to follow in order to ensure that you're building an accessible experience. So these are very straightforward. They generally fall into the category of whether you do not support, you partially support, or you fully support one of the success criteria. These are pretty clear and straightforward in terms of how you can comply with these guidelines, right? So the rule requires that you comply with 2.1 A and AA. This is a specific conformance level that these organizations are being required to comply with. And what does it apply to? So pretty much anything that is your responsibility, right? So this includes social media posts, public electronic documents, web content, and mobile apps that are procured from third parties. So I think it's really important to call out that this is not just the content and things that you directly own, right? So this doesn't just pertain to, your direct website or your direct social presence, things like that. This also pertains to anyone who is offering a service on your behalf. So another vendor, you need to ensure that they are accessible. That's your responsibility to be asking them and following up with them to make sure that they're adhering with these guidelines ahead of ADA Title II. So really quick to touch base though on these guidelines. Yes, they're guidelines. People tend to perceive them still as boxes to check, things like that. But why are they the guidelines? Why is it this way, right? These guidelines are built on 4 core principles that are really rooted in ensuring that we're building an accessible product, right? So the first one is perceivable. So components in a digital experience and a website, they must be presented in a way that users can sense. And this is worded really well to cover both cases where, for example, someone is visually impaired and they may not be able to see the interface at all, like the Domino's Pizza example earlier. Uh, it must be presented in a way that someone can sense that in that case, they can be heard by a screen reader, right? Or if I'm, just a normal sighted user, or maybe I'm hard of hearing, I can at least see the elements to be able to interact with them. Which takes me to the second point. So the interface must be operable. So users must be able to interact with and navigate the interfaces, right? So that means I have to be able to use the actual property. I have to be able to make payments online. I have to be able to navigate around the interface. It needs to be usable. Third, it needs to be understandable. Again, think back to our senior citizen cohort earlier. The content must be easy to comprehend. So if there are long passages of text with tons of multi-syllable words, if there are tons of acronyms, if there are lots of pieces hidden in different areas that are really vital to completing the task, those are all things that stand in the way of an accessible experience and things to look out for. It really needs to be worded as directly and plainly as possible so that you can reach as wide an audience as possible, which is, of course, what accessibility is all about. And finally, I think this is one that's actually quite possibly the most important to think about, but it needs to be robust. So content must be interpretable by a broad range of customers. A way to think about this is that, for example, if you have a website, don't offer functionality on a desktop website, for example, that differs from what you would see on a mobile device, right? Users need to be able to have the same amount of functionality and content available to them, regardless of what device they're using. So it needs to be robust. It needs to support the functionality that's capable, right? So, for example, if you are saying, hey, if you visit us on a mobile app or a mobile site, you need to go to the desktop in order to complete your transaction, that would be an example of breaking the robust principle, right? So these four principles, the core principle, generally speaking, is how and why we determine that the guidelines are enforcing creating accessible experiences. So the big thing is, what should you expect from your vendors, right? So as we said earlier, it's your responsibility to ensure that your vendors are offering accessible experiences on your behalf. So there are ways that vendors can demonstrate this to you. So first and foremost, we have the VPAT document. So this stands for Voluntary Product Assessment Template. And this is an actual document that will state very plainly where a particular vendor falls in adherence to the success criteria for the WCAG guidelines, right? So as you read one of these documents, it will go from top to bottom to say whether a vendor does not support, partially supports, or fully supports the criteria against the guidelines, right? So the VPAT document is really the source of truth to ensure that you are actually evaluating a vendor on where they stand on the accessibility guidelines. Second, we think it's really important. Accessibility really should be baked into product development. Accessibility is really not its own thing to do. It is really the way to build the best product, full stop. It's a best practice. It is how you should be thinking about building these experiences if you're a vendor that's serving others, right? So asking questions around how a vendor thinks about accessibility during their product development process, right? Is it something, that could be evident that maybe they rushed to meet Title II, or is it something they've been thinking about for years and they have, champions on their teams that they can name? They can talk about educating their staff. They can talk about just how they're doing things on an ongoing basis, right? Just because they say that they're accessible today and they give you VPAT saying so, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case 6 months down the road if they don't have the proper processes in place in order to maintain it. And finally, I think, again, possibly the most important thing is a third party evaluating their work? So if we go back to the VPAT document, anyone can offer a VPAT document. So anyone could download the document, they could fill it with all supports, and they could send it to you and say, hey, we're good, right? They can use terms like we're 100% compliant, we're certified, things like that. You need to ensure that there's a third party involved that is actively evaluating that vendor's work. That is your real trust signal to say, Okay, they believe in this enough that they have someone else that is contracted that is regularly reviewing their product to ensure that it is accessible. So when you're in this process, if you're in an RFP process, things like that, asking about this, asking for names. Is it a company? Is it a consultant? Who is it? Who's responsible for being the third party that evaluates their work to ensure it's accessible? So something that's really important, again, like hopefully it's clear through this presentation, right? But accessible design requires just this continuous improvement mindset, right? Accessibility is something that is never done, and we feel very passionate standing on that statement. This is a way to build. This is a way to move your product forward continuously and to be thinking about it, right? So it really is something that you can't ever really fully put a stamp on, right? It's something that you need to sort of accept as these are best practices. These are the ways that we need to build our product. These are the things we need to be expecting of the vendors that serve us to ensure that we are building as accessible an experience for our customers as possible. So how do we do this? So InvoiceCloud has a process. So we have educated staff internally. So we have designers and front-end developers, engineers, product managers that have been educated on accessibility and the best practices of accessibility, and further understanding the real intent of accessibility to build a better experience, right? So we've educated staff. We've made the changes in the platform thus far as we've found issues like we pointed out earlier around the payment summary, for example. We've made changes in our platform to actively push the experience forward. And as we've been doing this, as we've been making these changes, we've been working with our partner, Level Access, who is a trusted player in the industry. And so as we are pushing things to our production environment, we're requesting Level Access to review our work, right? So they're coming in and they're double checking us. They're tapping us on the shoulder and saying, hey, you might need to adjust this piece, things like that, right? It's really important to know that they are actively part of our process in reviewing and ensuring that we are delivering an accessible product. So we've committed to delivering a VPAT document twice a year in partnership with Level Access. And I think you'll find as you talk to vendors in the space, many will be on a cadence that's more like every 12 months, every 18 months, every 24 months, that sort of thing. So we've committed to not only making the changes in the process, educating our folks, moving things forward, but also having Level Access ensure that we are delivering an accessible experience for our customers. And so I know this has been a big presentation. There's been a lot of information. There's a lot to think about. And accessibility can feel super daunting. It can sort of feel like that project, at home that you don't want to make eye contact with, right? It can feel like a big, scary thing, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the real point is you can start making progress today. You can start asking questions today. You can start thinking about this within your own properties today, right? Small, continuous, incremental progress is the way to be thinking about this as you move forward. Acknowledging that it's something that you need to do, something that your vendors need to do, and just making it part of the overall experience for your customers. So some of the key takeaways, just to touch on these again, like asking the right questions when you're evaluating tools and solutions, right? So ensuring like, do vendors have documentation? If you don't currently have this as a question in your RFP process, add it. Ask them for their VPAT document. Ask them next about how do you have an accessible best practice tied into your development process, right? Ask them about that. Third, ask about third parties. Name names. Figure out, are these consultants? Is this a third party, like a true larger company? Who is the third party, if any, that's involved in ensuring that they're delivering an accessible experience? And the final point, again, just to call it out, accessibility is never done. This is an ongoing thing. This is a way to build experiences. This is a way to build a product. This is work that is always going to be part of how we do things, and it really is worth it. When you're building an accessible experience, as we saw earlier, yes, you are meeting compliance. You are, able to comply with the WCAG 2.1 AA. You're able to do that, but you're building a better experience for everyone. You're really doing something that is going to make your customer experience so much better across the board. So as a final thought, We have a digital accessibility readiness checklist, as we mentioned before. And so, again, just to reiterate, like, this isn't solely the responsibility of your payment provider or another third party that you work with, right? This is ultimately your responsibility to be thinking about. So we have this downloadable checklist that you can use to self-assess both your payments vendor, other third parties, as well as your own organizational's website, social media posts, and electronic documents. And so with that, thank you. Really appreciate you spending time with us today to learn more about just such an important topic that is accessibility. Again, we're going to be sending the checklist that your team can use to evaluate the work that needs to be done, either on your site or with your payments vendor. You're also going to receive an on-demand recording of this session that you can send to colleagues or you can reference later on. And if there are any questions that were answered in the chat, we're going to do our best to collect emails and respond to you one-on-one. You can also feel free to send questions to the email that you see on the screen. And next, keep an eye out for our next installment in the Customer Confidence webinar series, where we'll be digging into new data about how your customers prefer to make payments and how you can align your payment experiences with their expectations. With that, once again, my name is Matt Radel. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Have a great day.